Here to cover all things crime, history, and politics, we are At the Desk. I'm your host, Emily Koza, and in today's episode, we will be talking about former President Trump's time in and out of office, influential civil rights leaders, Jeffrey Dahmer, and all about the history of Valentine's Day. Now come take a seat with us at the desk. Welcome to ATD. We are your newest show to cover all things history, politics, and crime, so tune in every week to get the latest. First, we'll be sending it over to our politics panel to discuss former President Trump. Over to you, Jordan.
Thanks, Emily. One Republican candidate has been in the lead this entire election season with about 80% of potential Republican primary voters on his side. Former President Trump will be likely to be the Republican candidate on the ballot in the 2024 election. However, while he has support, he has a lot of opposition as well. The former president has been indicted 4 times, was impeached twice while in office, and state Supreme Courts have tried to take him off their ballot this year. We're going to take a look at Trump's first term and key events that followed after his time in office. So, Trump, frontrunner this election season. Let's take a deep dive into his first term in office, what went well, what maybe didn't go well, and then lead in from there.
So I got to be completely honest. His first term in my book was a complete and utter success. The economy was growing, violent crime rates were going down. Everything seemed pretty good from what I saw. I mean, you saw, unemployment rates at a record low for almost all minority groups. You saw, like I said, violent crime rates down. Inflation was being controlled. I thought he had a very good term.
I think my biggest problem was division in the country. I felt a lot of division. When you look at what happened in Charlottesville, you can't really be happy and be like, well, crime rates did go down. If you saw what happened in Charlottesville, you're going to be disgusted. You're going to see how Mike Pence tried to defend him on national television, didn't look too good. Then you're going to see his reaction came hours and hours later, and he said, this was obviously not scripted because he looked down after making a speech. He said, there was good people on both sides. I guess that's true, but can you really say that when you're trying to unite the country? I don't know if he really approached that properly. And then you go into the statistics, but you also have to look at the fact about his relationships. I was not a big fan of his foreign policy relationships. I didn't like, how much, I don't know what the right word to use is, but I didn't like his relationship with Putin. I didn't like his relationship with Kim Jong-un. And I didn't like what he said most recently. And what I was going to say was, I'm not sure how much we're going to talk about his 2016 to 2020, 2017 to 2021 was his time in office. I don't know how much we're actually going to talk about the 45th presidency and what he's planning on doing if he becomes the 47th president, because now he's talking about not sticking up for NATO allies, which concerns me.
That's a big concern for me, too. I mean, choosing to encourage Russia to be more aggressive towards our own allies because they didn't pay, that, to me, is a huge international relations faux pas. I mean, that's not really something that you can say and assure me personally, and I'm sure millions of Americans out there, that you're going to do what's best for our national defense. And like you said, I completely agree with you that his relationship with Putin was very dodgy to me. I feel like they were a little too close considering the U.S. relation with Russia. Speaking of international relations, I do want to talk about his promises because, Jackson, you said that you think his term was successful. I like to think of term successes in terms of promises. And one thing that Trump promised was to decrease our trade deficit with China. Our trade deficit with China has actually doubled since Trump has been in office. He has not done anything to decrease. He did rearrange the NAFTA deals, but I actually had to do this for an exercise for one of my classes. If you calculate based on the volume of imports from China, that actually increased steadily as the years went on, save for COVID, of course, when the international trade shut down.
And I would put some of that on COVID. Just some of the international trade, the economic policies that happened as a result.
I agree with that. I agree with that. So, but I do want to add on to your point, yeah. How about that border wall?
That Mexico was going to pay for.
Yeah, so
Ron DeSantis took that one over. He's like, I'm going to build the border wall. Well, he got really far.
He completed 400 miles of it. Yes, he came short on that. I'm willing to admit it. He did come short on the border wall. But I'm saying as an overall term, I think it was successful. Because was it perfect? No. Was there division in the country? Did he address the Charlottesville issue, for example, perfectly? No. But the economy was strong, and you know what? I love the Kim Jong-un. I didn't love the Putin as much, but I like that those countries respected the United States in that
I mean,
time.
I think all of you guys make a really good point here. Like you said, there was a lot of economic success, 7 million new jobs. He brought a lot of production back to America. Unemployment rates were really low, and I think it's important to look at, there were some really good things that came out of his presidency, but also, like you guys were saying, there was also a lot of things that weren't great, like the division that was created. I mean, the fact that when he was leaving office, it wasn't necessarily a peaceful transfer of power. This president has been impeached twice. He has 4 indictments. There's a lot there that kind of show, while there were some successes, there were also some falters on his part, especially like I think you said with how he talked to other foreign nationals and other prime ministers and such. There were times where it just didn't feel like it was America putting their best foot forward.
Well, so I like to play both sides of the aisle and not, necessarily just throw out my political opinions. I'm going to say this. Trump may have committed some crimes, but impeachment is a political tool at this stage in our society. I said that last week on the crime panel. We were talking about Bill Clinton. It's been a political tool. It doesn't necessarily mean you've committed a crime. It can mean you've committed a crime, but I don't like to measure impeachment as a failure anymore, especially in the sense where it didn't necessarily work out. Donald Trump has still not formally been impeached he's been impeached by the House of Representatives, but by the Senate. So in a way, it's a political tool because he was impeached by a Democratic House as a Republican president.
Yes, I mean, he didn't leave office as a result of the impeachments. He was impeached twice, yes, on paper, but he never actually left office as a result of them. So yeah, I agree. It was more of a political tool than anything else.
And you know what? It goes on both sides of the aisle, too. We saw it with Clinton, because obviously there wasn't a crime that was necessarily committed. He was never prosecuted for a crime in that case scenario. And then we're obviously seeing it right now with Biden and Hunter Biden. So, I mean, it can go both ways in terms of, is impeachment a political tool, or is it actually a way to properly remove someone from office who's abusing their power?
Definitely. And I think before Trump got impeached, people kind of saw it as something like super big. And yeah, I really did. Me personally, I also interpreted it as charging someone for a crime. But as I saw the events unfold in both his impeachments, I was like, okay, so this is really just a way for one party to say, I don't like you in office and I want you out. And it's just a lot of political maneuvering. And I feel like it's kind of taken away from the weight that the word impeachment or that whole process holds. So just another way that Trump has really influenced our political sphere.
That's what Secretary Alejandro Mayorkas said when he was being interviewed on Meet the Press by Kristen Welker. He was saying, I'm being impeached because they're not happy with the job I've done, which is fine. You're allowed to have your opinion, but I have not necessarily committed a crime that should remove me from office.
But what are your guys' thoughts when it comes to this impeachment? Because the first time it was his dealings with Ukraine, withholding maybe military aid, and also asking them to dig into the Bidens. And then the second time, because as it was quoted, with the insurrections. Do you think that is something a president should be able to do and get away with? I think, especially with our international relations, probably not a best thing to do.
Well, the question is, what did he actually do with that? That's my question for America, because from what I saw, he didn't do anything that was legally, able to, justify causing an insurrection. He said to peacefully march to the Capitol. Now, what his followers did was not peaceful, of course, but you can't, hold him accountable for what all these grown adults did.
I don't like to talk about it because both sides of the aisle have their rights and wrongs in the case scenario.
Of course, yes.
Donald Trump is talking about the First Amendment and saying the Constitution applies to me too, but at the same time he's also saying he can do anything he wants as president. So it goes on both sides of the aisle.
But I think also, Jackson, you talk about them being grown people, and I completely agree. Like, no matter what Trump said, like the exact words of what he said, these people still made the decision to go and riot, basically, at the Capitol. And that was just unprecedented. We've never, ever seen something like that in the United States. However, I think it's very important to recognize that Donald Trump is not an ordinary person. He's not like you or I going and saying, oh, hey, guys, let's all go and storm the Capitol. Like, this was the president of the United States, somebody who, like I said last week, has such a vice grip on his party, on his supporters. So if he says something and he knows this because that's how he has been getting away with all his comments about women, his comments about racial minorities, his comments about people in his own party, like he's gotten away with it because he knows the sway he has over people. And you're not telling me that he's not conscious about that. So him saying that, I think to a certain extent he knew that it was something big was going to happen because of how much influence he has.
I definitely agree with you there. And speaking of the sway he has, he's now been charged with a couple of different things: conspiracy to defraud the United States, conspiracy to obstruct an official proceeding, obstruction of and attempt to obstruct an official proceeding, conspiracy against rights. He was charged once he left office, and now that he's running for another campaign, another presidential, hopefully winning a presidential election here, what are your guys' thoughts on having a candidate who is currently being investigated and charged with crimes.
Well, there's allegations and there's convictions. Right now,
I agree.
there are allegations. So I'm not going to say anything unless he's convicted.
I'm going to have to side with Chris Christie on this one. He said the voters have to make their choice. This is democracy. Technically, anybody can be voted in, as long as they follow constitutional policy, in which he is, as of right now. So it's the voters' choice. Do they want a convicted felon to run the free world?
Well, he's not a convicted felon yet.
And that's why he's not convicted
Jackson
yet.
said.
If he would become
If
one,
he would
yeah.
be convicted. The idea doesn't sit well with me. I'm going to be very honest with you guys. Yes, if we want to play with semantics, he's not a convicted felon, but this is somebody who time and time again has shown that he thinks his position as president basically makes him immune. And it just kind of makes me feel uneasy. I guess if I were in his shoes, I would have laid low. When I have a total of like 91 felony charges coming up against me, laid low a little bit, and then maybe ran for president at the time. But again, this is Trump.
Right.
So
was about to
these
say,
charges have
he is-
actually propelled him
He
and
is
taken him
Donald
to
Trump.
new targets.
He does tend to benefit off of controversy. That is part of his brand
sure,
for
for
his
sure.
whole
I
life,
mean-
not just his political career.
And the thing, too, that kind of got me was with these charges and these criminal charges, him saying, oh, but if I become president again, I can just pardon myself. During his time in office, he pardoned 70 people, and he also had another sway over 73 people's sentencing. What do we think about that? And pardoning yourself once you're in office, we've never seen a president do that. Is that something we could do if he feels like he needs to, if he's charged? Because I agree, there hasn't been any convictions. So we can't look at this saying we have a felon trying to run for president, because that's not a fair thing to say. But it is definitely a little concerning for the American people seeing someone with allegations against him trying to continue to run the United States.
It's constitutional at a federal level. Any federal crimes that are prosecuted, he can pardon himself. Can he pardon himself in the state of Georgia? No.
Great point.
Good point.
I mean, yes, what he did was legal as far as the pardons go, and so you can question the morality of it, but for legal purposes, it was allowed.
Right,
So,
but when we talk about legal and we talk about morality, and America is a country that prides itself on being the moral center of the free world, of the world in general. And to me, what type of example does that send to the rest of the world, where we have corrupt politicians everywhere? How does that make America better if we have somebody who has allegedly brought 102 classified documents into his hotel Mar-a-Lago in Florida? How does that look to the rest of the world, that we're saying we're the moral center of the free world, and yet we have our president pardoning himself for crimes that he has allegedly committed? I mean, that's just not a good look for us.
I agree with you on that.
it shows. I think it shows confidence in himself, because he's further proving to the world, and I mean not proving yet, but he's saying I didn't do this stuff, and that is why he's pardoned himself.
My problem, too, is hypocrisy. I mean, Mike Pence has done it, and Joe Biden has done it. They found, in Joe Biden's Delaware garage, they found documentation that he should not have had. So it goes on both sides of the aisle. I'm not trying to defend one guy or the other here, but my problem here is hypocrisy. Both sides of the aisle are saying, are accusing things that they've done themselves. That was something George Santos said. George Santos was saying, yes, I lied, but somebody who told me I lied and is trying to get me out of office pulled the fire alarm. That's a federal crime. So both sides of the aisle in certain case scenarios, and it seems like right now the Republicans are bearing the brunt of it, but it goes both ways in history.
I definitely agree with you there. I think it's important to look at both parties and just the government as a whole. We need to put a better foot forward, because like you were saying, we tend to look at the United States government as the gold standard, be like us, but is this something you really want to be like with all this corruption we may see? We really need to work together to bring unison to the government and just to move forward maybe with more understanding and less butting heads and fighting against each other. But speaking of butting heads, the Supreme Courts, the state Supreme Courts, trying to keep Trump off the state ballots. What do you guys think about that? Because I know there's a lot going on right now with the U.S. Federal Supreme Court trying to make a decision on, can they do this, can they not? What do you guys think?
Again, I want the voters to make their choice of who they want to run the free world. And if, state Supreme Courts, if they think they have legal premise to make a decision like that, Ryan Lowy, a freshman in college, is not going to stand in the way of that. But I personally want the voters to make their choice.
Yeah, I feel like this would be better as a referendum, something that's presented to the voters, to the population. Additionally, there has been talk of like the Supreme Court maybe stepping in, and I really don't think that that's the best way to go, because again, the states are the ones who get to control
They
how
should
their
choose.
votings work. So I don't know how that would work out.
When they didn't step in Florida, you remember that all those years ago when they didn't step in Florida, Bush became president.
Oh.
People said that wasn't what was supposed to happen.
There you go.
The Supreme Court didn't step in. So do you want to look back at history? Do you want to repeat history, or do you not want to repeat history? So it goes both ways. I know I'm contradicting myself. I'm just, throwing
Politics
both
is a
options.
That is
contradiction
a
in
great
and of
point.
itself.
Now,
Exactly.
here's the thing, though. They're basing, the justification for why they want to take him off the ballot is because of the insurrection clause. And like I said earlier, he hasn't done anything that justifies the insurrection clause which is Section 3 of the 14th Amendment.
I mean, I think it's a tough balance here because you don't want to let this is a choice for the states. You want the states to be able to make their decision, their votes, how they want to do voting. But also, you don't want to let them say, oh, we don't like this candidate, so let's just keep him off our ballot. It's a tricky situation of, should the federal government step into something that's the states' rights, or should the states get to make that decision? I agree with you guys. I think the voters are the ones that should get to choose, because at the end of the day, they're the ones picking the next president.
And again, this has never happened in United States history, so we don't have anything really to base this off of. The insurrection clause, there has never been a president that has been accused of violating that clause. So, and insurrection, it's such a heavy word, such a lofty idea. How do you conceptualize it? How do you ground it in something that's real? Like, how do you separate rhetoric from real action? So I think Jackson is right in that sense of that it's very hard to outright say he caused the insurrection, because he's very good with his words. I will admit that.
I agree, but that's all we have time for. Will voters overlook Trump's criminal charges and remember the good he's done during his time in office? Will they give the current 81-year-old president a second term? I guess we'll see this November. Back to you, Emily.
Thanks, Jordan. Stay tuned for our history panel as they discuss Martin Luther King Jr. and Malcolm X. We'll be right back at the desk. We are back at the desk. Now it's time for the history panel as they talk about Martin Luther King Jr. and Malcolm X. Over to you, Yaya.
Thanks, Emily. African Americans have been battling racial justice since before slavery was abolished. However, the civil rights movement between the late 40s and 60s, when the world bore witness to landmark cases and laws such as Brown v. Board of Education in 1954 and the Civil Rights Act of 1964, is widely regarded as the period where the greatest progress toward racial equality was made. Today, we will be discussing two of the most prominent leaders of the civil rights movement, Martin Luther King Jr. and Malcolm X. So going straight into it, these are both people that we know and have studied since we were in elementary school. Martin Luther King, he was the president of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. He has worked with big names such as Rosa Parks. He conferred with JFK. He also worked with Lyndon B. Johnson, who actually ended up signing the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act of 64 and 65. He was very much more of a reformist. He was for working within the system and finding out what we can do to change the system that we already are living in. So that is how people remember him to this day. Malcolm X, on the other hand, he is often painted as being Martin Luther King's complete opposite. We see their philosophies as being diametrically opposed. He was the leader of the Nation of Islam. So again, we have two very opposing people, Martin Luther King being a Baptist, Malcolm X being a Muslim. He was a huge proponent of black nationalism, which is the sentiment of just black pride and social justice and moving forward towards a racial equality, which is often confused with black separatism, where black people would maybe create their own nation. Malcolm X was kind of dabbling in this realm, but towards his later life, he wasn't. They were both assassinated. Martin Luther King, April 4th, 1968, and Malcolm X just a couple years before that, February 21st, 1965. So talking about Martin Luther King, he was basically born into the church, and let's talk more about him.
Well, Martin Luther King Jr. was born on January 15th of 1929. He was raised by a Baptist preacher who was named Martin Luther King Sr., surprisingly. And so as a child, Martin Luther King Jr. was friends with a white boy And they were friends in their formidable years up until they both went to two separate segregated schools, in which the boy's father said to Martin Luther King Jr. that they could not see each other anymore. And it caused Martin Luther King Jr. to kind of reflect on this moment. It was a pivotal moment in his childhood. His parents were Christians, so they taught him to love those who hate you and to forgive those who have wronged you. And this kind of leaked into his philosophy as he became a civil rights leader. But when he became a preacher at the same church that his father was a pastor at, he had a great skill at oration, and people saw this as a boon for civil rights. And his way of speaking was very passionate, but it was never very hateful, which garnered a lot of support from his community and the community abroad. So he would go on to try and desegregate the downtown part of Birmingham through nonviolent means, which would be through like stand-ins, boycotts, but this eventually landed him in jail. And so the clergyman of Birmingham, the white clergyman of Birmingham, wrote him a letter that said, condescendingly so, hey, what you're doing is disruptive, what you're doing is counteractive towards what you want, and you should let us, the white people, do it for you. And so he didn't really take kindly to that, and so he wrote them a letter in response covering a few points, some of them being that injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. Like, if this is happening in Birmingham, this is definitely happening in my hometown of Atlanta, Georgia. This is happening all over the country. He also made the point that nonviolent action forces a community to pay attention to the problem at hand. They could no longer ignore it, and that the people who were involved were trained for that moment. They were trained to be put up against people who were being aggressive towards them and to not act violently in reaction towards them. And one of the most important points that he made was that freedom was never freely given by the oppressor, but rather it was demanded by the oppressed. And this letter in specific would send King's notoriety into the stratosphere.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. When you talk about the notoriety of Dr. King, it's almost impossible. It's mythic. He's such a legend in civil rights history, in American history, in world history, right? But you certainly can try. And as Drew mentioned, Dr. King was nonviolent. He was Baptist. That obviously sharply contrasted against Malcolm X. They had two different ideologies, but they did have the same goal. And Dr. King was incredible at grassroots organizing of all these different protests, right? Everything was non-peaceful. He created some of the most iconic and important moments in American history just by simply speaking to people around and telling them, we're going to do this together as a culture, as a community, right? The civil disobedience which he practiced, which is a better way of probably putting it, was so unbelievably influential in American culture at this time. I mean, as you mentioned, the letter from a Birmingham jail is one of the most important pieces of written media in history. You can also talk about his I Have a Dream speech, which of course is some of the most notoriously important American narration in history. It gets right up there with the Gettysburg Address. When you talk about great speeches, you always will mention the I Have a Dream speech. That speech actually garnered him a Nobel Peace Prize at the age of 35, making him the youngest person ever to win a Nobel Peace Prize. Also, one of the first actual Americans to win the Nobel Peace Prize as well, within, I believe, the first 6 or 7 of those. And this notoriety doesn't end anywhere. You can talk, we have a holiday after him for a reason. He is one of the most important people in history. He's the only non-president to be memorialized at the Great Mall in Washington, D.C. He's the only non-president to have a holiday named after him as well. And in his Nobel Peace Prize, one quote that I do want to mention is, I believe that unarmed truth and unconditional love will have the final word in reality. And I think that is a quote that completely summarizes what Dr. King stood for, and it completely summarizes his entire ideology, which is an ideology that sharply contrasts from somebody like, say, Malcolm X.
Well, throughout the course of Malcolm X's childhood, you can obviously see there are many, many areas where he was able to formulate the ideas that he would bring into the civil rights movement from his own perspective. You know, starting at his early age, his father, Earl Little, was a Baptist minister, and he followed a lot of the black national ideals of Marcus Garvey. He was actually the president of the Omaha chapter of the UNIA Association, which supported black nationalist ideas. And his family, you know, they suffered multiple issues throughout his upbringing, especially starting whenever they moved to Lansing, Michigan, when their house was burnt down and the fire department was not dispatched to the scene, which Malcolm would later state as being caused by a white nationalist group, a white supremacist group. Malcolm's father was later killed in a streetcar accident, and then that would further dissolve his distaste, as he would again blame it more specifically on the Ku Klux Klan. Later down the line, his mother was institutionalized for being mentally insane, and unfortunately that took an entire toll on him and his siblings whenever he was forced into foster care, unfortunately. And despite receiving great grades, he had his white teacher actually diminish his own dreams of having a career in law. And that eventually pushed him to kind of make some poor decisions whenever he moved to Boston with his half-sister. And he started going on sprees of stealing with his friends and actually a gang of white women, in fact. And this eventually resulted in him going into prison whenever he converted to Islam, which actually would be sort of the forefront of how he formulated his ideas and explained them to the public and how he gained his mass following.
Yeah, absolutely. So he joined the NOI, the Nation of Islam, in prison, and afterwards he became a minister under Elijah Muhammad. So by the late 1950s, Malcolm had become the NOI's leading spokesperson. He would deliver these mass sermons to his followers, urging them to defend themselves by any means necessary. So kind of the opposite, or not really, going hand in hand with what MLK believed in. But so in 1964, Malcolm X left the NOI and he made his pilgrimage to Mecca, where he embraced Sunni Islam, that branch of Islam, after which he kind of dove headfirst into political action. So in 1965, he created the Organization of African American Unity, in which he wanted to kind of internationalize the civil rights movement and make it more of a human rights issue rather than just civil rights. So he wanted to kind of guide the more militant activists of that time. In January of 1965, he said in an interview that the Organization of African American Unity would support fully and without compromise any action by any group that is designed to get meaningful, immediate results, which kind of, I feel like, summed up a lot of his strategy was just immediate results. Malcolm X was assassinated on February 21st, 1965, while he was delivering a lecture in Washington Heights. 3 members of the NOI were arrested for the murder. One of them fessed up and told the jury that the other 2 had nothing to do with it. Malcolm X was survived by his wife and 6 daughters.
So both amazing people that have been studied time and time again, but the question that I want to ask you guys is, who do you think was the most influential during the civil rights movement?
It's hard to say because I find that one can have their cake and eat it too in this situation, because both of these men were extremely important for their prospective audiences. Malcolm X was not a civil rights leader for the moderate white person. He was telling black people at the time, hey, arm yourselves up, protect yourselves if aggression is brought upon you, because that is exactly what was happening at that time. Whereas MLK was more digestible for a more moderate white kind of consumer base, even though you could say that a lot of African Americans at that time also loved him too. I'm sure that comes hand in hand, but he was more so like peace and love and let's get along with each other, and I'm not gaining anything and you're not losing it. It's not like a nil-sum kind of game here when it comes to civil rights. Like, it's all good for all of us if we are able to operate in a society where things are fair and free.
Right, and I want to build off of something that you said, because Malcolm X, he was very big about defending yourself as a black person if, aggression is ever brought to you, because we say 2 wrongs don't make a right, but in this case, in the case of history, it's not really 2 people committing wrongs against each other. It's a community that has been wronged for hundreds of years finally taking up arms and defending themselves. So in my view, in my personal view, how can you defend our Second Amendment right and not expect black people to do the same if they're being provoked. But additionally, something that people overlook about Malcolm X is that he didn't just call for black people to defend themselves. He actually called for them to be educated in the ways of how our economy works and just take up a book. He has a very famous speech that I feel is very much undervalued, The Ballot or the Bullet, in which he says, as black people, we are being prevented from voting. So know that your rights are not being protected, and knowing that, now you can make your decision, take up the ballot or take up the bullet.
Yeah, I completely agree with you. I lean more towards the Malcolm X side. However, it is really hard to say who was more influential in like human history. I think if you're using the term influential, you'd have to say MLK just because he is one of the most renowned people worldwide. But in terms of ideology, I personally agree more so with Malcolm X. And I think this is really just because I personally struggle to see the good in people. And I think that was a big part of Malcolm X's, is that he was not going to see the good in people. Whereas Dr. King believed that kindness and love and togetherness as a whole, as a United States of America, could bring peace and unity to all. And Malcolm X was like, we need to understand that these people don't care for us. We're being brutalized, we're being hurt. We have to prepare ourselves for the worst. And I tend to lean more towards Malcolm X just because of that.
And I'm going to somewhat back up your argument a little bit. I'm personally a pacifist, and that's kind of where I stand. So naturally, I'm sort of leaning towards Martin Luther King Jr. However, to say that one is influential over the other is just false. I think they both had different ideals. Malcolm X was more for black power of self-reliance and determination. However, it was a completely different scenario where Martin Luther King was speaking to a mass audience, and he had mass appeal amongst all races. He was calling for equality across the nation. So whenever you make the argument like, oh, one's more influential over the other, they were influential in their own rights and in their own arguments. They were fighting for different things. And yes, they're both civil rights leaders, but you have to differentiate the two.
Yeah, I mean, I completely agree. I don't know how we can really compare the two besides in their ideologies, but when it comes to being influential, the ideas are so complex and very different. I personally think that you can't really fight fire with fire, so I lean a bit more towards MLK on that side. But I completely understand that how are you going to get people to listen if not for matching them with what they got too.
Right, but let's not forget that MLK was not liked by 63% of the American population, but today we memorialized him as this giant that brought together races when in reality a lot of white people were not liking him. So I think that puts them a little more closer together than one would think, and I hope that that message kind of is transmitted to our audience. But regardless of whose philosophy resonates most with you, their contributions to the civil rights movement were undeniable. America still has a ways to go when it comes to racial equality, but we must remember the trailblazers that came before us to hold on to the vision of a better future. That's all the time we have for today. Happy Black History Month, and we'll be back to discuss more influential historical events at the desk. Back to you, Emily.
Thanks, Yaya. Stay tuned for our crime panel as they cover Jeffrey Dahmer. We will meet you back at the desk. We are once again back at the desk. It's time to send it over to our crime panel to discuss the disturbing case of Jeffrey Dahmer. Over to you, Savannah.
Thanks, Emily. Welcome back to Crime Reviews. I'm Savannah Barr, joined here by Ryan Lowy, Sam Rascio, and Eva Hines. Today, we will be diving into one of the most chilling and infamous serial killer cases in history, the disturbing case of Jeffrey Dahmer. With 17 victims beginning in 1978, Dahmer terrorized the nightlife of Milwaukee, Wisconsin. His victims were all males of minority races and or with disabilities. He would often lure his victims back to his home where he would carry out many different crimes. Finally, in 1991, and after 13 years, Tracy Edwards, soon to be Dahmer's 18th victim, escaped to tell the tale. Now, it's well known that Dahmer had a very rough childhood growing up, with his mom leaving and a rocky relationship with his dad. Sam, do you want to tell us a little bit about that?
Yes. So, Jeffrey Dahmer had a awful, and I mean awful, childhood. A lot of aspects of his life were awful. You know, in the criminology field, we discuss this nature versus nurture, kind of what forms killers to be killers. And with Jeffrey Dahmer, it was kind of a mix of both. First, I want to mention the biological aspects. So his mother was known, she had a lot of anxiety, she had a lot of depression. After his brother was born, she suffered from postpartum depression. This caused her to become distant with Jeffrey Dahmer, leave the family, and we don't know if Jeffrey Dahmer had some form of depression. Now, I'm not saying because the mom had depression, he 100% also had depression, but since it's a little bit biological, he could have had some of the same tendencies that his mother had. Also, his dad went out and claimed that when he was 8 years old, he was sexually abused by a neighbor. Now, that is not, we don't know if that exactly happened. That's what the dad is saying. But again, the dad was also removed from his life, so we can't fully trust what the dad was saying. But we see a lot of times that doesn't have a direct correlation, but it can trigger bad behavior. And we know that he sexually abused his victims. So in that moment that he supposedly, what the dad said was sexually abused, he lost his power. So it would make sense that he sexually abused his victims to gain the power back that he was once lost. Also, his parents had a very toxic relationship. It was physical, it was verbal. He was kind of living in that household environment, which could lead to some issues, some anger built up. Also, with that sexual abuse, he had no one to talk to at home. It was known that he developed weird kind of habits. He was obsessed with roadkill, which his dad was also obsessed with, which is strange. Obsessed with bones, obsessed with organs, and that kind of, if the parents jumped on that, it could have been averted. These kind of habits that he had could have been telling to what he would want in the future. And we know a lot of serial killers, they start by killing animals. So there was signs as a child, and he was gay. Jeffrey Dahmer came out to be gay. His father disapproved of him being gay. His grandmother sent him to church all the time. So he just did not grow up in a good childhood, and I think that really affected how he turned up.
You know, it's really interesting. I want to add on to that Jeffrey Dahmer's father is who originally got him into the roadkill. And I think, in a sense, he kind of used it as a way to get closer to his father. It was something they could bond over and connect with when everything wasn't really going right with them.
Yeah, and one thing I want to mention is, by me saying this, I'm not saying everyone that suffers abuse or anyone that suffers depression becomes serial killers, but it is a form that, criminologists look for when trying to explain why people kill, because we honestly don't know. We don't know why Jeffrey Dahmer killed. He confessed, but we don't really know what was going on up there.
Yeah, and his parents divorced, and he was very lonely. His father moved out, his mother took his brother, they ran off, so he was completely alone. And at the end of the day, he didn't have many friends, and he was completely alone, which, as we'll see down the line, contributed to a lot of his murders.
So, bouncing off of what you said first before I go into law enforcement and the court's response is that we never actually got to investigate his brain.
Yeah.
We took John Wayne Gacy's brain, not we, as in me. I mean, the government investigated, labs investigated. They didn't find anything unique about his brain. They were talking about doing it. The parents of Jeffrey Dahmer had a fight about if they wanted to give the brain. A court said, you know what, we're just going to rip the brain apart, we're going to burn it. And that's what happened. But now we're going to go to my topic of law enforcement and the court's response. So Jeffrey Dahmer happened to have been able to cakewalk the police a lot. He got pulled over at one point with a body in his car, one of the earlier bodies. Law enforcement was going to test him for DUI. They said, you know what, you're young, we don't want to do that to you. They asked about the smell in the car. They did not dive deep into it because, again, they felt bad. He was young. They felt he had a future. They didn't want to know what was going on. It was a nice thing to do, but it was not professional. We move later on. Mr. Synthasimphone. You're going to hear that name a lot. He was unfortunately abused by Jeffrey Dahmer. Dahmer had killed people up to that point, but they did not have that on him. They only had the fact that Synthasimphone was, assaulted by Jeffrey Dahmer. Dahmer was arrested, and the courts felt bad for him. The court said, you're young, you need to learn your lesson, I believe the judge even said himself that he was related to somebody who had problems just like Jeffrey, or they believed the problems he had. They sent him to jail. He was on work release for multiple hours a week, and he got out after a year. He didn't get any mental treatment like his father requested. So basically what happened was that the courts did not dig deeper into Dahmer, and law enforcement did not react too well. This dives to the later point. We're back on Synthasm phone. This was very unfortunate. Law enforcement showed up and returned Synthasm phone when he was trying to escape Dahmer from the Oxford apartments in Milwaukee. Those law enforcement officers, unfortunately, after they were fired, were reinstated thanks to police unions. Unions are good, but unions aren't great, in just like a case scenario like this. Unfortunately, law enforcement failed. The courts were oblivious. This is something that we have seen happen a lot in infamous crimes just like this.
Yeah.
It's really unfortunate because he was 14 years old, and not Dahmer, Synthasm phone,
who unfortunately passed away.
Was 14 years old. It's not like he could have fought for himself. So it was really law enforcement, and we, as a society, we rely on law enforcement to do the correct thing, but unfortunately, they don't always do the correct thing, and this is a scenario where they didn't.
Mind you, this is a century earlier. We're talking 1900s, 20th century law enforcement did not have body cams, did not have dash cams. They were not, they didn't have as much of a target on their back. Obviously, this was after Larry King, but this was not a racism issue, so nobody was up in arms about it.
Yeah, it's just kind of a shame to see how little the law enforcement did with the whole situation. I mean, this was going on underground for 9 years. This was happening for so long, so it's just kind of a shame to see how bad that the law enforcement took this. So I kind of want to dive a little bit into his first murder case, which is the murder of Stephen Hicks. And Jeffrey was 18 years old, along with Stephen Hicks, freshly graduated from high school, and he was in Ohio at the time. And he was driving his car, and Stephen Hicks was hitchhiking to a music festival. And he pulled the car over for Stephen Hicks, and he got in the car, and he was like, I have alcohol, weed back at my house, if you want to come over, drink, smoke, talk a little bit. So they go back to his house, and to make things clear, Stephen Hicks was heterosexual, so he was not into any of the sort of things that Dahmer wanted to do. And Dahmer had claimed that he wasn't planning on making any sexual passes at Stephen Hicks during their night together. So the night went on, and it kind of came around to that time, and Stephen Hicks was like, I think I'm going to head out. And like we said, Dahmer wanted the control. He wanted the power. He didn't want anyone to leave him. He was a very lonely kid. So he hit him over the head and strangled him to death, which we see with a lot of his later murders. That's how he executed a lot of his victims. And he took his body down to the cellar. He did all unimaginable things to that. And that was kind of his first murder. It was kind of his first, case. And he was 18 years old. It was really sad, horrifying. His family didn't even know what happened to him for such a long time. They recently got an answer to everything that went on because it took him so long to admit everything. And what's interesting, though, is he didn't kill again for another 9 years. It was a big hiatus, so.
We see with a lot of murders is when Jeffrey Dahmer killed, he felt that control. He felt a sort of satisfaction, which when I'm studying criminology and a lot of things like that, killers, when they kill, they feel a lot of satisfaction. They feel happy when they do it. They get a rush of adrenaline that I think needs to be triggered in some way. He saw him, it was some sort of trigger, and he was like, I'm going to kill him. Now, the 9 years hiatus, we do see this with serial killers. He's not a mass killer. He's a serial killer. He's thought, he had to think through things. He had to feel that trigger again to want to kill again, which we do see.
There's a word that I want you to add to that, manipulation.
Manipulation.
He manipulated his victims. He terrorized, as you said in your intro, which was great, by the way, he terrorized nightlife. He went to nightclubs. He found certain victims, targeted them, took advantage, misportrayed himself to them, lured them back to what was his grandmother's house, and then to his Oxford apartment, where at that point all HE double hockey sticks went loose.
Yeah, he would drug them at these gay places, and he would take them back to his place and do unthinkable things. And we kind of see that pattern with all of his victims. And it really just goes back to the power, the control. He said growing up, he didn't have anything stable. He didn't have any family. No one stayed with him through life. He was so lonely. He felt so empty. And the thing about an unconscious person or a deceased person is they're not going to leave. They don't have power. They can't give you demands. They're never going to leave you. And that's what kind of fueled him. That's what drove him.
You know, and going back to that issue of power and control, I really do think it stems from his childhood with his mom leaving and the huge fights between her and his father. You know, it was later identified that his mom did, in fact, have postpartum depression that at the time was never identified. And just her packing up and taking his brother one day and saying, Jeffrey, you can't come with us.
Something I also want to note is, so when he brought the victims back to his apartment, he would put on a movie, he would put on a show that kind of transformed him into the feelings of wanting to kill. Now, something that I would ask Jeffrey Dahmer if he was sitting across from me right now was, did you go in with the intention of wanting to kill?
You're sending chills up my spine with that comment, just saying. Across from us. Continue.
Yeah, if he was sitting with it, I would ask him, did you want to kill? Did you go, because some serial killers, as we saw with Ted Bundy, like, he went to kill. He wanted to kill, but Jeffrey Dahmer took them back. He did sexual things, and then he watched the movie, and then he would start to make comments being like, I hear your heart, but it's going to stop. Like, he would start making comments like that. So he's, crazy saying that to someone, but I just want to know, did he want to kill, or was it those movies and was it those passions that transformed him into a killer in those moments?
Well, in my opinion, obviously, as we said, the first one was an accident, then there was the 9-year hiatus. Although that, of course, isn't not according to script of a serial killer, it shows that the roadkill definitely pushed it. There was a lot of symptoms, I guess you can say, to the disease. And I think, as you said, one of them was the movies. It was that, he was almost playing in his mind. He obviously, as you said, when he was younger, he was misguided, say the least. So when you're misguided, your brain isn't always in the right place when normal things happen. His brain wasn't in the right place when he was watching movies such as, and I know he was a big Star Wars fan. He's getting ideas from this and he doesn't know any better. And that's unfortunately one of the symptoms.
Yeah, I remember he even said he would put in yellow contact lenses to look different and kind of turn into this facade, and watch those movies to kind of put him into that headspace. He would watch things that reaffirmed what he thought was right.
And with all these crime segments, we always bring it to a bigger picture, and I think the bigger picture with this segment is, are people born killers or are they transformed into killers? And I think no one knows. I'm studying that in college right now. That's what people study. So I think Jeffrey Dahmer is a perfect example. Was he born a killer, or did his childhood transform him into a killer?
Yeah, and I think that's one of many questions. I think another question we can ask, I'm sorry, I'm a big law enforcement guy, is accountability in law enforcement. Can police units have this much power? Did the commissioner do the right thing? Obviously, the mayor took this politically. He said this could be more, than just a crazy serial killer roaming around Milwaukee if we don't take precaution. I don't think that's what the mayor should be saying when somebody terrorizes his city like that, So there's a lot of big questions that could have been taken out of this. But for what you were saying, obviously, studying the killer, unfortunately, his brain was never left behind. Was that an accident? Should they have destroyed it? We're never going to know, because we're never going to know what they found. But the fact that they didn't find anything in John Wayne Gacy, who'd killed upwards of 30 people, does definitely say something about that.
And I also want to talk about how he was killed in prison. I think that's a very important thing, because a lot of these killers that sexually abuse their victims, that kind of tortured them, they are killed in prison because they're hated by their fellow killers. We see that a lot with child abusers, sexual abusers, things like that. So maybe that was part of the reason why they didn't study his brain. He wasn't executed by the government. I don't know, but it's unfortunate, because it really would have been interesting to see.
I find this really funny. He was baptized the same day John Wayne Gacy was executed.
Yep.
That is one of the craziest facts, I think.
Conspiracy.
One of the craziest coincidences ever. And one thing to note, too, on November 28, 1994, at age 34, was the day that he was killed. However, Dahmer did not fight back. Instead, he just accepted his fate. He was done. He was done.
It just shows was he weak?
He became a man of religion, honestly, and I think that really tilted the scale.
He would always tell the police exactly what happened. I think at one point he kind of just ended it. He gave up.
Well, he was already arrested. The amount of times he's gotten away with this in front of people is just, the Oxford apartments it stunk. It smelled terrible.
Yes, it did.
So obvious.
And I'm sorry to cut you off, Ryan.
It's all right.
But unfortunately, that is all the time we have for today. The lives of Dahmer's victims were taken in unimaginable circumstances, leaving a lasting impact on their families and loved ones. Back to you, Emily.
Thanks, Savannah. Stay tuned for a special Valentine's Day segment. We'll be right back at the desk. Welcome back to At the Desk. To finish off today's episode, we present the history of Valentine's Day. Over to you, Brandon.
Thanks, Emily. February, the shortest month of the entire year. A month so tiny that every 4 years the calendar gods say, hey man, here's an extra day for you, just so it doesn't feel left out. But in this tiny little month falls one of the best or worst days of the entire year. Of course, the good and the bad depends on if you're a songbird of love flying around with your partner or a hopeless romantic flying around in a parasocial relationship with Miles Teller or Dua Lipa. Valentine's Day is, no pun intended, a holiday that has a love-hate relationship with the public, but the roots of Valentine's Day stretch down a long time ago to ancient Roman tradition and early Catholicism, and its story is just about as argued about and arduous as a relationship can be. But that's why I'm here, to give you a lovely summation of the history behind the holiday. The true roots of Valentine's Day lie in mystery, as scholars don't know exactly when the middle of February began to have been celebrated as a season of love. However, one of the earliest noted celebrations of that season was a pagan celebration known as Lupercalia, a festival that honored Lupa, the she-wolf of Rome, who was said to have suckled either Romulus or Remus, the founders of Rome, or Faunus, the god of fertility. The celebration was not exactly a celebration of love with chocolates and roses. It was rather weird. Priests would skin a goat for fertility and a dog for purity, and then dip their hides in sacrificial blood and gently slap the women in the streets to bless them with fertility. Now, the Roman women did welcome this, but after a few hundred years of bloody animal slapping, 5th century Pope Gelasius declared February 14th to be known as St. Valentine's Day. His effort was largely to Christianize the festival and turn more towards Christ and away from the gods of old and also bloody animal slapping. There also were many St. Valentines in Catholic history, so it's rather unclear as to which St. Valentine's the day was to honor. However, one of these Valentines had an especially big heart. He lived in the 3rd century AD under the Emperor Claudius II, who apparently was an incredibly vile and ambitious ruler, and he was so committed to military control that he banned marriages in Rome to prohibit his men from being distracted. St. Valentine, who was a priest, secretly married many of these different lovers who came to him, and when it was discovered what he was doing, Claudius was sentenced to death. And in his final days, many of the couples who he wed would come and visit him in his cell. You feeling lovesick yet? No? Perfect. It actually wasn't until many centuries later that we find definitive proof of Valentine's Day being considered a holiday for love. The first finding was from 1375, written by an English poet named Geoffrey Chaucer, who declared that the day was for every fowl who cometh there to choose his mate. It doesn't sound very romantic to me, but I digress. Now, it wouldn't be Valentine's Day without a handsome little guy with a bow and arrow. And I'm not talking about Legolas from Lord of the Rings. I'm talking about Cupid, of course. Cupid was based on the Greek god of love, Eros, which is also where we get the word erotic from. He was said to be able to control the romantic relationships of every man and women in Greece, and he apparently was an immortal and incredibly tall and handsome man. And he actually wasn't spoken of as a chubby little guy with a bow and arrow until the Hellenistic period, a depiction that has been recognized up to this very moment. We still see Cupid as that. He's on the back of cards and boxes of chocolate everywhere. Today, Valentine's Day is the largest selling day for florists worldwide, with an estimated 250 million of these little guys being sold every year and 36 million pounds of chocolate being sold every year. Now, unfortunately, I don't have the estimated percentage of that chocolate that's bought for the lonesome singles every year, but I would wager a guess it's at least 2%, give or take, definitely me this year. But Valentine's Day isn't just for couples. It's a day for love, a day steeped in ancient traditions, rewritten by the Catholic Church, reflected in a tragic tale of a brave priest, and polished off by the great poets of the medieval era. It truly is a holiday for all the singles and the taken, because hey, everybody loves something. Back to you, Emily.
Thanks, Brandon. Sadly, that is all the time we have for today. In the meantime, stay updated with ATD on all of our socials, and let us know what you want to see us cover next. I'm Emily Koza, and we will see you back at the desk next week.